everyone, my name is Raphael Hyde. Welcome back to Web3 Talks. Today we have Brandon Tory with us, who is the founder of Formless.xyz, also a former Googler. Before founding Formless, Brandon was a software engineer at Teradyne. Then he went off to Apple to become a senior software architect. And then he joined Google, where he was a staff engineer, after which created Formless. So thanks a lot for joining us today, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Super excited to be here. I actually see a lot of my team members here from the language info team, so thank you for joining. And I'm looking forward.
Definitely. But awesome, Brandon. So I really want to dig into kind of your origin story because I think it's super unique, especially since like you've worked at some amazing companies and obviously went off to build this project of your own. So why don't we take a few steps back and why don't you kind of share like the antithesis of what inspired you to build this out? Because you have a background in music and creative and also engineering, which is kind of like the unicorn cocktail that we never come across. So why don't you kind of bring us back to the very beginning?
Yeah, it's funny, to be honest, it really did start when I was a kid. When I was about 12, 13, I wanted to be a hacker more than anything. And so I spent thousands of hours just trying to learn everything I could about coding languages, Python, assembly, C++. I was the kid who was like reverse engineering games with a hex editor and trying to like figure that stuff out. And so that was a deep passion of mine. But at the same time, I lived in a neighborhood where like hip hop was just the language. It was the way that all of us kind of navigated the world and understood our reality, especially going through hard times. And through my own personal struggles, having young parents growing up in a rough neighborhood, tech and coding was just like an escape for me. And I became really passionate about it. But I always had this identity thing where I was trying to figure out like, who am I really? Am I kind of someone that's into the culture and the arts and hip hop, or someone that's in tech? And those identities didn't really go together. And so that's where the name Formless came from, this idea that we can kind of shapeshift as human beings. So I got a degree in electrical engineering. I got my first job working on device drivers at Teradyne. And then I decided to leave everything and become an independent artist and move to Atlanta. And so that's kind of where my music career jumped off. I got a chance to meet with or work with a lot of really great names in the industry like Timbaland and Dallas Austin. Moved to Los Angeles in 2014. And in LA, I really started to get my big break as an emerging artist. So I had like songs on Spotify with 1 million streams. Timbaland had discovered me, but wasn't really making any money as an artist, right? So I had to figure out a way to reconcile these two identities. And I decided, let me try my hand at big tech. So decided to join Apple, and I moved to Cupertino and started to do what I called multi-dream. So multi-dream was this idea of if I can high-speed context switch between these two worlds, maybe I can do both at the same time. So I'd be in the studio in LA, and then I'd drive back to work at Apple, and I'd just do this all the time. It was like kind of a lot, but it was during that time that I started to think about how can we maybe solve this music industry problem using technology? And blockchain was kind of a buzzword at the time. As an engineer, and I think a lot of my engineer colleagues was a little skeptical, like, is this really something that can help solve a real problem? But for me, the breakthrough was I started to think about the distinction between distributing music as a file versus as a program. And how can you leverage existing infrastructure, to programmatically distribute songs and to use this kind of method? And blockchain kind of emerged as a way to do that. So this was something I was thinking about in the back of my mind. Joined Google in 2018 in the Venice office, joined the natural language infrastructure team. Shout out to everybody on Glint. And worked really hard. And I love that team. We built a lot of great things, TensorFlow text, things like, if you've seen, familiar with any of the projects like BERT or T5 or any of these modeling things, we worked on infrastructure that supported those launches. And so took that very seriously, but also was thinking about this kind of blockchain space and music in parallel. And so end of last year, I started to put together a research paper about my thoughts about how this space could move forward. And I called it Share, which was this idea of decentralized distribution using blockchain technology. And so started talking to some investors and really became a believer, and talked to my manager, Greg at Google, and said, look, I think I'm gonna plan to transition out and do my own thing. And, he was fully supportive. And, it was an emotional moment for me because I really did love the team. And so I resigned in January and have been going full speed ever since. And so we've been building out this protocol and decentralized application. And so that's what Formless is all about.
Congratulations. I mean, taking that leap of faith is huge. I think all of us, especially now, looking at the economic climate and the volatility of the Web3 world, like you have some balls. So good job.
To be fair, it was a bull market when I left.
Yeah. And you're still here, so that's
Yeah.
huge. I do want to highlight a little bit of because you have such great firsthand experience as being an artist, and obviously like being in the ecosystem and in the media business. Tell us about some of the frictions that artists experience, because I don't think a lot of us in the call here recognize like the stuff you actually experienced and lived,
Yeah.
and now you're solving for those problems.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest way to think about the problem is to just think about money. So as an independent artist, or even as a professional, signed artist, it can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 in marketing to get to 1 million streams.
Okay.
And from a business perspective, 1 million streams gets you maybe $2,000 to $3,000 in return.
Wow.
So after a while of doing this, you start realizing like, okay, to sustain the marketing costs to kind of fight these algorithms and rise to the point where I can have a sustainable streaming revenue, it's just not justified by the return on investment, right? Unless you can somehow get to the point where you have a sustainable enough business that someone else comes in and kind of backs you to do that. So that's why a lot of emerging artists are complaining about this kind of ecosystem that exists in music. And there's a number of factors, right? There's things like algorithms on social media that make it a little bit harder to get ranked depending on the type of music that you create, or to control the relationship with your consumer base. And then there's things like distribution. So what many people may not realize is that when you press play on a Spotify song, an Apple Music song, or iTunes, that money doesn't flow to the actual creator. It actually goes through multiple hops, right? So it goes through first the platform that you're listening on, then it goes to a distribution company, it gets aggregated, and then it's paid out to the collaborators on the song on a monthly basis using pooled revenue that they decide on. So as the creator, you actually don't have any say in really your own business model of the access terms and the pricing of your music. And the reason it's like this is because someone has to run the code that actually creates the revenue stream and distributes it to the collaborators. Whoever runs that code makes the decisions. And this is why it's an interesting technology to be able to run the code associated with your song on a programmable blockchain, because it, for the first time, actually allows the creator to specify code that controls the revenue flow.
Gotcha. And when you talk about those like marketing costs, just so I understand semantically, is this just like advertising, distribution? Like what can you maybe describe some of those things for us?
Yeah, PR, advertising, social media management, having your own manager as an artist, all of these things come with an associated cost, right? Having a publicist even on retainer, right? Like that costs. And then doing things like getting advocacy for playlists. A lot of the industry now is based on algorithmic playlists and stuff. And there's certain things you have to do and certain companies you have to work with to be able to get into the right playlist. And it's extremely competitive, which is fine, but it's also very expensive and the ROI is not really there. So that's the challenge.
Gotcha. That's wearing a lot of hats, especially like when you want to be focusing on making music or whatever your art is.
Exactly.
That's complicated. All right. So thanks for painting the picture of like what the reality of the Web2 world is and those hurdles and such. And so as moving into the streaming world, so like, are you finding that there are the like major players that own distribution of music? I mean, I think of Spotify, Apple Music, but like who are those major players that, artists have to tap into?
Yeah, it's exactly what you said. It's Spotify, it's Apple Music, it's YouTube to an extent. I mean, YouTube is a really important platform in music and music video distribution. There's nothing inherently wrong with these platforms, right? I think that they solved a problem that kind of emerged through the Napster era, right? By kind of building a model where you can tap into sustainable ad revenue and distribute that to creators. But we've kind of reached a point in history where that model is no longer working. And so we're looking for what's the next epoch. And that's kind of what we're focused on here.
Gotcha. Okay. This is great. So let's get into Formless. Let's hear kind of like the bread and butter of like how you guys are going to disrupt all of this.
Yeah. So I always try to think, should I go technical? Should I not go non-technical? I'm going to go kind of technical and then try to like zoom out a little bit. So
yeah,
the fundamental idea, right? I think when people look at this space, we use the word NFT pretty often, right? And so there's a lot of headlines about how do non-fungible tokens and this kind of chain of provenance that are encoded on a blockchain, how does this solve the problem that I just mentioned. And what that really does is it gives you another revenue stream through collectible sales. So in addition to putting out a song, you can also put out a collectible associated with that song and monetize in a new way. And that's pretty exciting, but it's not everything that you can do with a programmatic blockchain. And so in Formless, we're much less concerned with the rising and falling prices of tokens or the secondary sales of NFTs. What we're really interested in is the fact that you can create programmable contracts that run on a global computer. Okay, so what this means is that rather than taking an MP3 file and giving it to YouTube or to Spotify and saying, hey, we'd like you to kind of administer the terms of service between the consumer and this file, right? What you can do now is you can create your own program that does that peer-to-peer. And so that's really what this is. It's a smart contract that administers the royalty flow, the terms of access, and everything else associated with that file on its own. So you package it into a program, you put it on the blockchain. Now what you have is the ability to have compatibility with multiple marketplaces and control of the access terms. That was never possible before. The only way you could have compatibility in the past is to be compatible with each of these marketplaces. So you have to give them the file and adhere to their terms. But with Web3, you now can put a program onto a global computer that administers the terms and still be compatible with any marketplace that can speak to a blockchain. And so that's the fundamental innovation.
That's amazing. So I kind of understand that as like you have an infinitely scalable robotic manager. It's like a robot agent of the future. That's awesome. That's so cool. And so have you found, because I mean, I've looked into this space a little bit, and so by no means am I an expert, but I've started to hear a little bit of some of the friction of, it's such a new, it's new technology, and like maybe some creatives, they're not like Web3 native, and so like how are you tapping into a market of artists that may not be comfortable with this tech, or maybe they are, maybe that's something I don't know enough about.
Yeah, it's funny. I think of Web3 as a technology that it has features, but it's not the whole story, right? So the question is, how do we solve the problem, and does Web3 support that solution? Not so much is everything about Web3. So in our design, we've kind of tried to abstract Web3 away from a lot of the consumer-facing touch points. For example, you can do things like transact directly with Apple Pay or Google Pay, and we'll handle the programmatic blockchain stuff behind the scenes. You don't have to worry about that. So a lot of the vision for us is, how do we use blockchain technology and the family of technologies for what they're really good at, which is this idea of a programmable state machine, and then also use the latest other technologies like Face ID or even Google Cloud to facilitate the other pieces we need. So within our stack, for example, there's a lot of stuff that we implement off-chain. It's not realistic to implement everything within the smart contracts. So we use things like GCP and microservices off-chain that interoperate with on-chain state. And that's how we deliver these features. So the idea is not to be kind of a decentralization, dogmatic brand or company, right? The idea is, how do we use this family of technologies to actually solve the problem?
Wow. Okay. So I want to go into that a little bit more, because I think a lot of people listening are like, oh my God, they're using our technology. How are they using it? So many people reach out to me and ask me, like, when you talk to people, like, what kind of services they need. So can you walk us through, like, maybe semantically, how did you stand up this service, or whatever you're comfortable sharing?
Yeah, I can share everything. All this is pretty much public in our documentation, docs.formless.xyz, and also the share white paper. But the fundamental idea is that a song in the future, or a podcast or a video, is not a file, it's a program. And that program is containerized through a number of deployment targets. Half of the deployment target is on-chain contract state. The other half is something that lives in the cloud through a service like GCP. And so one of the things GCP offers that's really, really convenient is cloud functions, right? So these are microservices. And you can integrate things within cloud functions that make them Web3 friendly, right? So you can send things like a blockchain signature in your request header to the function. And that means that the function can then authenticate and know that the person who's calling this function is this identity from the blockchain. And then you can use that to talk to the chain to say, does this person have access to this content? And so we call that the decentralized distribution network. So it's really this idea of, how do we use best-in-class technology from cloud and blockchain to interoperate together to solve the problem?
Gotcha. And so the cloud functions as they sit like on the shelf today,
Yeah.
are they working as in the best way that you want them to, or would you like augment them and or change them in a way
Yeah.
they're more suitable for your use case?
I personally think that I don't know if like obviously engineers and people that are very well versed in technology understand the power of microservices, but I don't know if the world generally understands how important microservices are.
Okay.
Because this idea of like nobody wants to run their own server, like that's something that's kind of been popularized when people talk about decentralization.
Hmm.
I don't know if that's necessarily true. If you have services like Cloud Functions and you can make that accessible and easy for people to just sign in and spawn their own microservice, and it's very easy to maintain and very inexpensive, I think you would see more consumer-facing applications where creators can manage their own service layer through something like GCP Cloud Functions. So for us, we offer our microservice fleet as a service to creators, but it would be
Oh,
great to be able to scale that and say you can bring your own authentication credentials and we can spawn microservices on your behalf. And now it's truly decentralized. So not only do we have the share Formless fleet of microservices, but each creator can have microservices that are in GCP, which they self-administer and self-maintain, and also interoperate with the on-chain contract state.
wow, that's interesting. Have you, and that approach, I felt like you're like kind of building almost like a templated microservice as a
Exactly.
service. Is that
Exactly.
something you guys are want to pursue?
I would love to do that. Yeah. So right now, this is something people have asked about, like, hey, are you going to open source the microservice code and kind of really continue this path of progressive decentralization? And that's something we would need Google's help with, right? But I think this idea of having progressive decentralization where the custody of the control of the microservice progressively goes into the hands of the creators as well is really exciting. Today, we facilitate that decentralization by making the microservice a mutable property within the contract. So what that means is the creator can always switch the service provider if they want to. And in that way, there's no single point of failure, which we control.
Wow, that's cool. And so said microservices, I know we're getting technical here. Would they be, are they like infrastructure agnostic? Or would this just be like native on GCP, or could you port this over to?
Infrastructure agnostic. I mean, you can take the same microservice code and stand it up on AWS Lambda, because it's just a small program. But we prefer GCP.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Nice. I'm sure people on the call love hearing that. And anyone who's on GCP, if you're listening, it sounds like there's some cool opportunities out there. You guys should reach out, work together. This
Yeah.
is exciting. I love this. So let's talk about the Share app. And I know that's kind of like pretty hot right now. Maybe you can break down what that is for everybody.
Yeah, so Share is really divided into 3 layers of foundational significance. So at the base layer, we have what we call a decentralized distribution protocol. So this is a set of smart contracts that live on multiple blockchains like Ethereum, Polygon, and they facilitate microtransactions for access to content. Now, the real innovation there is how do you do royalty splits? So in the creative industry, you have a lot of songs or videos or things that are produced. They have a lot of collaborators. There's Kanye West songs that have 100 producers. So when the money moves on chain, you have to have a way to actually move that money to everybody who's a rights holder of the song. And that's expensive. So that can actually be more expensive than the amount that you want to transact. So it's actually unrealistic to do on-chain streaming. So a lot of the work that we did was coming up with a novel way to facilitate that so that we have infinite scalability with the number of collaborators, and we're still able to facilitate on-chain transactions. So that's the base layer, this on-chain streaming microtransaction protocol. Then on top of that, we have our cloud API, which allows our partners to distribute things to the blockchain without having to know anything about Web3. And we use Cloud Run for this. So we have a GCP Linux server that has all the benefits of the scale that Google has built, but we have a bunch of Web3 code running on it that knows how to do smart contract deployments, and we know how to interoperate with different blockchains. And so we can offer as a service to different business partners, hey, you can deploy stuff to blockchain with custom smart contracts, and all these terms that we talked about can be codified into the contract using one RPC call, right? So that's the cloud SaaS layer. And then lastly, we have the decentralized consumer-facing streaming application. And this is where you can literally just text someone a link, what we like to call smart contract links. It looks exactly like a Spotify song or an Apple Music song or podcast episode.
Mm-hmm.
You can hear the preview, you click it, and it actually brings you to an interface where you can transact for access for a limited amount of time, depending on what the creator specifies. So you can put out a podcast and you can say, you know what, it's going to be 99 cents and you get 1 week of access, and it's completely facilitated on the blockchain independent of our company. So we're just giving you an interface to transact with that content.
Wow, that's awesome. And just so I understand, what chain are you guys on?
Yeah, so we're a multi-chain protocol. We're deployed on Ethereum and Polygon mainnets, and we're working on ZK Sync as a next step.
Gotcha. And so like when you're talking about the the server that you guys are running on for the second layer, does the chain specification matter on how the deployment works?
Oh, it will for non-EVM compatible chains. So there's kind of two high-level distinctions between blockchains. One is EVM compatibility, which means everything independent of the smart contract language you use, it all compiles down to bytecode that's compatible with the Ethereum virtual machine. So that's Polygon, that's Ethereum, that's a couple other blockchain targets that adhere to that standard. And then you have other chains that are non-EVM compatible, like Solana. And in that case, it does matter because you have to rewrite your contracts using a different kind of tool chain.
Gotcha. And so when you guys were standing up those services on with I forgot, what kind of server are you running?
So we have the microservices, which use Cloud Functions, and then we have the Cloud Run server for our kind of deployment service.
Gotcha. Was there any issues with the compatibility when you wanted to interface with
No,
TCP?
because Cloud Run is it's not very opinionated about the technology, right? So if you can use Node, if you can use things like Python or whatever language, then essentially the sky's the limit. So there were no issues.
Gotcha. Okay, that's great to hear. I just want to say, I don't know how you have a creative side of your brain and a technical side. This is ridiculous.
I think my tagline is kind of music is technology. I kind of think of it as like it's all bits at the end of the day, and it's all about collaborating with good people to figure out how to codify things.
Well, that's cool. I'm glad you've been able to harness like more of your brain space than the rest of us simple humans. But let's talk about your users and how people are like, taking this on, or the reactions they're having. Like, how has that been going?
It's been really, really exciting to see some of the reactions. I think right now we're still in like what we call visionary and early adopter phase. People that are like web3 native, they're creators, they want to experiment with new technology. And so our product is an alpha, and they're working with us to like tell us what they think and give us feedback. We hosted a Twitter space the other night where in aggregate, I think 300 people kind of tuned in, and we had a lot of great questions and thoughts like, how do I blend this with my traditional Web2 strategy to take advantage of blockchain? And what we've kind of been working together on with our users is strategies to do that gradually. So let's say you have a release or a podcast or things that you're already doing in Web2. You can offer some type of premium experience, right, as kind of an add-on using peer-to-peer blockchain technology. And as people get used to that, and as you gradually provide more value, you can bring people into the space. And because we don't actually require the consumer to connect with a wallet, it means that barrier is gone. And this is really important when we talk about NFTs. The NFT business model, nothing against NFTs, but the NFT business model is really predicated on transfer of ownership. So you're selling the NFT. And what that means is, as a prerequisite, the recipient of ownership needs to have a wallet so that they can custody the asset. But we're not selling NFTs. We're using the NFT standard and the smart contracts under the NFT standard, but we actually don't transact ownership, so the consumer doesn't have to have a wallet. So these are the types of things where what we're saying is Web3 technology is really amazing at certain things. And I think we as an industry need to break out of the predetermined notion of what an NFT is. NFT is an interface. It's really a standard. It's not really a concrete implementation. So you can take that standard and implement whatever you want. As long as you implement that interface, you're compatible with multiple marketplaces. And that's the beauty of NFT.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And I feel like that paradigm shift is much like if we all moved to Germany and we're all using euros now. Everyone's using euros. Like, but I have US dollars. Like, sorry, those don't work here. And you're like trying to convince everyone that euros are the future. But it's like, no, I don't believe you. So I think that's kind of the mentality that I have. So is there a component of the project where you're like, if you're going to educate people on some of these primitives and on-ramps? Because a lot of feedback that we get is like, there's all these great solutions out there, but nobody wants to like learn how to do a new thing. So like, how do you guys take that on?
That's probably been one of the biggest challenges, especially coming out of like heavy engineering mode. I found myself talking probably more technical than I should at
Mhm.
times. So I'm trying to be more mindful of like switching to give people more of a vision perspective than like the technical perspective. But I think that's really the key, right? The key is to go deep with the technology, understand the technology, and then like put the other hat on and remember like there are people that haven't tried this at all yet, and talk about the actual problems they're seeing and how you can solve this, maybe without even using the word Web3 or blockchain.
Mhm. That would be a good exercise to describe all the things we work on without using any of the Web3
That
like
is,
language.
exactly,
Oh, that's
exactly.
funny. So what is your vision? You mentioned that briefly there. Like, I mean, what you're working on is incredibly disruptive, and I believe in this, and I think it's the way of the future.
Thank
But
you.
do
Thank
you
you.
have a broader vision?
Yeah, I mean, I truly believe that in the future, you know, creators will be in control of both their content and their ability to communicate with their audience. And I think it'll be facilitated by programmable blockchain technology. And what I think this means is we have a really exciting future ahead. You know, I think that we'll see things like supply and demand in the digital content industry, where you may have an indie podcaster who's able to command, you know, $1 an episode for just an hour. Or you may have someone that pumps out a ton of content and it's cheaper, or maybe it's free. But the idea is it needs to be everybody's choice. And
Hmm.
so the idea of kind of disintermediating the control structures is what I see as the future. And what's really exciting, I think, is how this transcends into social media, which I really think of as communication. So
Hmm.
both content creation, digital content, and then the way that we communicate on the internet, I think is going to be disintermediated.
I like that. And I think there's probably a lot of labels and producers that are like shaking now when people talk about this. Like in the conversations you've had, I mean, it sounds like, you know, you worked with Timberland in the past. I know he has a project that's also kind of looking at this space.
Yeah.
What are you hearing from people like that have like deep legacy roots and investments into making sure that these like, you know, lifetime 360 contracts kind of
Right.
own the artist?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a sense of you know, people want to make sure that they know what's going on, they're making the right decisions, and there's an element of trust and safety that we're trying to foster within the space, right? We don't want to send the message of, hey, you're going to be left behind, right? The message is,
Mhm.
no, we can achieve greater things together. So like, for example, we're working with Beat Club and trying to figure out how we can collaborate. That's Timberland's company. And so really, I think a lot of the fears are kind of misplaced, because even if you are a label or a distribution company, it doesn't mean that your role goes away. It just means it gets codified into a smart contract. So you still can take your 50%, your 30%, whatever you want. We just envision it as a partnership structure between you and the creator in the contract. And so I actually have never been one that thought that the label was the problem. There's differing opinions here, but I've always thought that, you know, labels are good. They provide resources, they provide marketing. They should be compensated as well within the smart contract infrastructure. And so I
Mhm.
think there's a place for all those players in the future.
And just so I understand the economics behind that, so because I often hear, you know, sometimes labels take advantage of artists, but is it like really, I mean, this might be a dumb question. Is it really hard for labels to find artists that will be successful? Like, is there like a ratio, like 1 out of 100, kind of like 10% of startups are successful kind of thing?
I mean, the music industry changes like every 6 weeks, every couple of months. So like the model just keeps changing. The technology, everything's racing. So it's tough to give one answer that's true for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
As of right now, it's very data driven, right? So what you're typically looking for is some success metric that's already been proven through social media, whether it's TikTok. The problem with that is that tends to cause artists to optimize for a specific way to create,
Yeah, yeah.
which is okay if that's what you want to do, but it's also problematic if that's not what you want to do, but you're being forced to do it because algorithmically this is just the way it has to happen, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the world that we're in right now. It's almost like when you choose a loss function for a machine learning model, like things are just going to optimize that way, right? So
Yeah.
so that's the way the industry's going. Basically the output is being determined by metrics on social media, so everything has to kind of coalesce into that model. And that's how a lot of labels are kind of picking winners. What I'd love to see the industry go back to is more so valuing the actual art. And it
Mhm.
doesn't mean we won't still see those metrics on social, but I think that by having the supply and demand economy and creative content, it gives more room for other formats and other types of creativity to cut through.
Gotcha. So we just can't keep 3D printing new BTS bands.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
That's exciting. Well, is there anything else around like this Share app or Formless that you want to share? I want to make sure you have like enough time to just like kind of really expose cool things you guys are doing.
Let's see. I mean, we covered a lot. I think our beta is launching in October. You can find all the information on formless.xyz. We have developer docs. We have all the information about the smart contracts. The smart contracts are available. You can read the code. You can look at that if you're interested in that stuff. I'm on Twitter. The whole team's on Twitter, so reach out to us. Happy to talk anytime. We have a Twitter space on Sunday evening at 8 p.m. So formless_XYZ if you want to join that space. But no, I mean, these questions were really, really good. So I think we got a chance to dive into some of the deep stuff.
I have more. I just wanted to make sure I give you the chance. So let's talk about, Google, obviously, giant company. You know, we have hundreds and hundreds of products, all sorts of services. Some I'm sure we've just like forgotten about. But what can we do? Like, what do you see? Maybe not Google per se, but like large tech companies. What is their place in Web3? In whatever frame you want to place that.
My opinion is that big tech company. First of all, shout out to Google. I feel like Google was like 10x gravity training facility for engineering. Like I just loved everything about the culture and what I learned while I was here. But I think that in the future, positioning some of these products to be adopters of these open protocols that are on the blockchain. So, for example, a lot of companies are making steps to say, hey, let's support NFTs on our platform so that artists can consume these things. And that's a step forward, right? But then also like these programmable smart contracts that are on an open protocol like Share, how do we make sure that we're prepared for that evolution where the distribution is actually happening on an open blockchain, and then products like YouTube or Spotify can then actually leverage that content from the blockchain and provide premium experiences to their users. I think is the way that I see things going forward.
Gotcha. And is there anything specific that you guys would really gain from? And you mentioned YouTube. I think I agree. YouTube seems like very, very well positioned to support like creator content, collectibles, etc. Like, what do you think really makes sense for artists?
So what we call is pay for access smart contracts. So if any platform can essentially support pay for access smart contracts that are on the blockchain through their own interface. So you could imagine being able to do a peer-to-peer transaction with a creator through the YouTube UI, but on a protocol layer being powered by something like Share. And so that's really the vision that we talked about in the Share white paper, is how some of these already very popular consumer-facing applications and platforms can start to think about adding these new models where they're actually peer-to-peer transactions that are facilitated by the protocol layer from Web3.
Gotcha. And then with that, have you guys explored any pricing models? I know that's like generally one of the biggest, points of disruption for any of these large platforms. Is like, okay, so like we have our margin, and then everyone else wants a piece. But like, how do we split that up? Or I don't even know how to start the conversation. Pricing is so complicated, but maybe you've thought about it.
Yeah, so within the Share protocol, we essentially have a revenue share model with marketplaces that integrate with the protocol. So the business model is essentially transaction fees for access to digital content on the entire internet. And as a marketplace, if you choose to enable those transactions with the protocol, then you also can take a split of that revenue fee. Now, the actual price of the asset is determined by the creator. And that's the entire vision. The creator should specify the terms of access, the amount of time, and the price. And with that is where we see this kind of future vision of supply and demand economics for the creative economy. I think there will, in the beginning, it'll be largely based on existing precedent. And the existing precedent is probably iTunes, which is 99 cents, download forever, right? I think people are kind of comfortable with the idea of 99 cents. And so then you say, okay, well, what's the access time that makes sense for 99 cents? I think that's probably the starting point. That's what most creators we've talked to understand and are comfortable with. But as the space evolves, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw things like the verse Jay-Z just did being $100 to listen to. You know what I mean? Like that type of model, because certain creators can actually command different pricing depending on how in demand the content is.
Gotcha. Sorry, Ricardo, I'll get back to your question in a second here, just because I want to follow up on that. So do you see a world where there's like spaces with like, oh my God, we gotta go here. The music here is so expensive. Like they're paying like $10,000 worth of music tonight. We have to go listen to it. Is that gonna be a thing?
Maybe. That's what's so exciting to me is that, I think the idea is let's lay a foundation and see how it evolves. And maybe there will be spaces where, we have these premium musical experiences. One thing about music is the value is often a function of time. So I think really what you'll see is first week to get early access, it might be more expensive. And then artists may choose to over time say, okay, it's going to be lower, or maybe one day it'll just be free. Like next month, it'll be free because that first week is when artists really monetize. So it's going to be completely dynamic. And that's what I think is exciting is you have these programmable songs and everybody can make their own rules.
That's so cool. I love market economies like this.
This comes back to that idea of working directly with artists to understand where they are kind of with their audience, right? And so there are really two problems if you talk to emerging artists. And these problems kind of transcend even into mainstream really big artists. And it's reliable communication with your audience that's not dependent on an ever-changing algorithm, and then the ability to monetize and create value within that audience. And so we want to solve both problems. And we think that fundamentally, the on-chain royalty streaming mechanics powered by blockchain can solve the exchange of value problem. Now, what you do is, I think, on a case-by-case basis, you work with artists to say things like, how do we create messaging where within your audience, even if you only have 5 fans, even if it's just your family members, right? How do we create messaging that says, by transacting on this piece of content peer-to-peer, you're actually supporting my art directly, and there's no intermediary, and telling that story and using personalized messaging and music to kind of slowly build into a world where we see everything in this way. So I think we really have to start small and go from 0 to 1. And so the way we've approached it is every artist is different. How do we tell each artist's story and get the content that we think is going to have an emotional reaction, and kind of price it accordingly, or make it free and pair it with content that's priced as an exclusive add-on as a way to kind of gradually build. Now with this comes the idea of the communication problem. And so over time, what we intend to do with Share is also provide the ability to communicate with your audience in a decentralized way too. This way, as you're kind of getting these value signals of how much people love the work you do, you can tell them the next time you have work out, and you're not being filtered by some of the traditional algorithmic filtering systems. So that's kind of like the first piece. The second piece about the pros is a really, really good question. And we have talked a little bit to like BMI and some of those folks. Dallas Austin, who's a big songwriter out of Atlanta, he's one of our investors. And so, he's been thinking about this too. I think it's another one of those cases where the institution and the idea of the pros still matters and is still a good thing. The technology they're using to do it, I think, will dramatically change. And so ultimately, I think the source of truth in the future will be the blockchain and the contracts that codify the terms. And the pros' jobs will probably be to do integrations with some of the venues and the live performance places where you're actually tracking those analytics and then feeding it back on chain to make sure that the rights holders get paid rather than some of the legacy systems they're using now. So I do see them as friendlies, but the question is, how feasible is it and what kind of timeline would it be for them to integrate with the stack, and how easy can we make it for them to do that? I've seen some papers about like, automated systems that can hear audio in a space. And I think the missing piece is how do you take that and then facilitate the transaction on chain to automatically pay the rights holders rather than having to retroactively kind of backfill that revenue. So I think that's really cool. And also we've been talking to the distribution companies, right? So how do they fit into this space? And that's where I think having things like the cloud API where they can just send an RPC and publish things to the chain is really exciting.
Oh, wonderful. We are at time, but Brandon, this was so great. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your amazing project, and all your work. I know everyone, based on the questions and the enthusiasm, I'm sure people really enjoyed it. People showed up from all over the country and the world to join this conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Royu, great to see you. Alex Ociano, great to see you. My whole team, everybody. Thank you for having me. Lu Yao, everybody that showed up, I really appreciate it.
That's so awesome. Well, we'll have you back sometime, and good luck with what you guys do next. We'll keep in touch.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Bye.